Well, I think we just went live and we were broadcasting. We're recording now. And so if you caught the tail end of that, Brian and I have our 3-year friend anniversary today. The things that come from spontaneous camping trips and friends of friends of friends. Actually, I know Brian better than the friends I went on that trip with.
It's been deleted. I have the one of your butt in the raincoat jumping in the water. But it must be on my old phone because, the rock stacks.
Yeah, nice. We did lots of rock stacking out there. Okay, everybody, welcome to the Turtle Island Research Cooperative's House of Being Seminar, Section 2, Being in Time, Division 1, Chapter 5. We're doing the rest of Chapter 5 today, and then we'll be finishing up with Division 1 next week, where we finish Chapter 6. So, yeah, we've got Ty, Brian, Sammy, and myself here, and Jacob is joined. Andy has like 6 things came up for him all at once, and so he's not able to join today. A couple other people are straggling in. We expect they'll be here soon. We'll see though. And a few other people also have some things going on. So anyway, but yeah, at this time of the year, it's probably going to get harder and harder for people to join. I know for instance, Frank said it's going to be very hit and miss for him with all the stuff he's got going on with his family. So, it's summer, so that's to be expected. Really excited that everyone of you has made it this far, that you've persevered and that you might be getting something out of it. I'd like to hear a little bit about people's reflections on the reading so far, and even perhaps this chapter. You said something a minute ago that would be relevant.
In general, I found this chapter, so far, Chapter 5 has been my favorite. This is one of those things where it's I really can't wait to reread it because I don't know that I can articulate so well why I really enjoyed it. But yeah, it definitely was one where maybe it was because this week I had more time to really sit down and read it slower than I have other weeks. So yeah, just going into this conversation, I'm enjoying it. And I also realized today, in regards to this whole thing, Thursday is my least favorite day of the week until it gets over. And then I realize how great this part of it is. But I go work for 10 hours, and then I have a half hour between work and here to get food in my belly, recalibrate, and then begin this whole thing. So the last 2 hours of work, I'm I don't have enough time. But then by the end of it, I'm always God, I love my life.
Cool. So not questions, just reflections right now?
Really, however
it leads to questions.
How the spirit moves you, I suppose, as not Heidegger would say.
The language hides within itself. Rascal! Sorry, there's a cat scratching furniture.
So my cat is over the top. He's scratching furniture, and he's not allowed to. Being naughty. We should put him in that coffee table for prison.
Oh my god.
Sorry. It's a distraction, but it won't be in a second here. So Brian's putting that coffee table over my...
Oh, bad kitty.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh my god.
Bad kitty.
He'll know not to scratch furniture.
He'll probably just lay down.
All right, Sammy was reading a quote.
The language hides within itself a developed way of conceiving. Page 198. Heidegger. So I thought this was really interesting because it sort of reformulated the way I think about language. Or it helped me to understand what he says in another essay, which is that language is the house of being. And language hides this whole understanding within itself. What?
Where is that quote?
Page 199.
Oh, 199. I was looking at 198. Where on there?
I don't know.
Oh, you just had that kind of written down somewhere.
Right. Because the articulation, basically of what is pointed out from within the interpretation that's within the understanding. So the articulation is in accordance with significance, and significance is this whole way of like understanding that's prior to the articulation. So like when language isn't built up through assertions, it's, how did he say it? Something about words accrue to significations. Was that
to significations words accrue? Yes.
Yeah. So that's just like the opposite of how you normally think about it.
He says to significations words accrue on 204. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, so today's reading began on 188, right? And unless anyone has any dwindling questions from previous to this section 32, which is on 188, we could get right into understanding and interpretation, and then assertion, right? And so understanding and interpretation, these are understanding is equiprimordial to state of mind and discourse. So we already did state of mind. We didn't talk about it a whole lot last week, but being there in state of mind was on 172. Fear was the example that he uses. So that was section 30 on page 179. But so state of mind, and then understanding, which will be like this next several pages, and then before you're done with section A, he talks about the third aspect, which would be discourse. And so discourse, understanding, and state of mind are equally primordial or equiprimordial. And so if we can kind of flesh out what those are, how those work, what those relationships are, why they're equally primordial, how it is that they are prior to assertion, or that assertion is derivative of those three things, and like what the significance of that is, that would be helpful. But I mean, that's something that's on my to-do list for this conversation.
I think that would be very helpful.
You think that'd be helpful?
Yes.
Absolutely.
It seemed like Brian already said the last bit was easier, right? I mean, after it's really section A. So Braver says that section A in this chapter is phenomenology proper, whereas section B is more existentialism. So existentialism meaning like it's literally just playing off of several themes in existentialism. It's taking what's done for the first half of the chapter, and then it's giving like a more like, well, this is how it plays out at our common experiential level, I guess.
It's appealing to lived experience, to like not just back up, but to, how does he put it? What page does it transition to section B?
That's what I'm trying to find out.
It's 210. Okay, so
yeah, so
he says, okay, we shall try to bring Dasein's everydayness into view in a manner which is ontologically more primordial. And then he's like, the disclosedness of the they, this is all the same page, should be made visible in certain definite phenomena. So he's like, well, we did all this phenomenology stuff, now let's make that visible in certain definite phenomena. So we're not like just speaking in generalities as much, we're talking about like these more specific like instantiations of the disclosedness of the they.
Cool. So can anybody does anyone want to suffer a sort of oversimplified paraphrase of what was going on with state of mind, or what you think state of mind might have been about, seeing as that's going to the state of mind, discourse, and understanding are all like this equiprimordial.
The footnote for state of mind is helpful, I found. I don't know what page it's on, but I remember last time, like the first time, reading through chapter 5 at the beginning, I pretty much crossed out state of mind every time and put something else down, but I can't remember what that thing was.
I put disposition because Dave said that was a better translation.
I put the state in which one may be found, because that's what in the footnote he says more literally the state in which one may be found, and I was like, that makes way more sense than state of mind. So I was just like crossing out state of mind and putting the state in which one may be found every time.
Yeah, Michael Downs says that it's taken from a German colloquialism. So it's the direct translation for what we have here as state of mind is basically the equivalent in German for like, how are you doing? You know, so it's like, yeah, so it's like, you know, where are you, you know, there's lots of different ways that question gets asked when you meet somebody or you come across them. And really it's just like, where are you at? You know, where's your head at? Or where have you been? You know, what's going on with you?
What mood are you disclosing?
Yeah. But I mean, what are some of the statements he's making about mood, though, I think are pretty, I mean, they should be pretty controversial. Maybe not with this group, maybe, but I mean, he's saying, I mean, ultimately you got to remember that he's going to be arguing that assertion is derivative of what we're calling state of mind, and that as such, also like the logos is implicated as something secondary to state of mind, which is, you know, traditionally in philosophy, it's taking the precedent or priority.
Yeah, so
I took assertion as kind of like sense making. So we have discourse, and there was like one paragraph at least where I started replacing discourse with mediation, and it made it all make a lot more sense to me. I don't know why, but so we have this understanding. We have your state of being, or whatever, the state of mind, whatever we want to call it, or mood. These are all sorts of modes of Dasein's being that we're thrown into. They're not things that we like determine for ourselves. We don't, for Heidegger at least, we don't determine language or discourse. It's something that we always already have. We don't determine understanding. It's something that we always already have, and we don't determine our state of mind. It's something we always already have. That's not to say that like our actions and things don't impact that, and that's not to say that we can't like do certain things to change our mood, say. Like if we're upset and we know chocolate makes us feel better, we could eat chocolate to make us feel better and change our mood, I guess. But it's still something that is always already there. Like we go towards that circumstance having always already been in that circumstance. And then I read assertion. So assertion, I think, literally, like the term that they're literally translating means speaking out. And I took that as like a form of representation or sense making. So we represent things in order to make sense of them. And it's easy to see how that falls into like substance ontology. And sorry, I'm reading 1,000 Plateaus at the same time, and Deleuze is doing similar stuff with representation, but he uses different language. So I almost said something Deleuze uses, and I kind of like Deleuze better. But Heidegger's dealing with representation too, right? And I kept thinking about Deleuze's image of thought.
Well, I totally agree. I mean, oh, sorry, you cut out.
There might be interesting, yeah. Oh, there might be interesting things of like power and control.
Cutting out real hard.
And in the same way, he's like, this is not. It leads to this idle talk or whatever, which masks what we're actually trying to get to.
Okay. Reading assertion as representation seems like something sounds off about that, and
No, I don't think that's what I'm trying to say. Assertion is speaking out, and one way we assert is representation.
Right, and
Okay.
and also,
that makes sense.
I mean, if we're thinking Deleuze, then like, and I was, because of difference or repetition, it's like an assertion is to say, A is A, right? It's the building block of any science, and especially it's like the cornerstone of logic. It's the law of identity. It's the pen. A pen is a pen. Well, what is a pen? Well, it has these characteristics, and those are all assertions. And then to build up any positive science, you're doing it via assertions. And so, I mean, that's the formal way that we do that. But I mean, we do it in casual conversation as well. And yeah, so and it's going to be really. I mean, this was the first time that I had really noticed that he says that through assertion, and we'll get here. So we'll bring up this page number in a little bit, but he says that assertion picks out something that's ready to hand, but it picks out something present at hand in what is ready to hand. Like, so it calls your attention to some present at hand part of what's ready to hand. So it takes a piece of the totality out, and then it does so with an understanding. It reifies an understanding that is present at hand. And he says that that's done by foresight, and foresight is part of the force structure of understanding, which I think we should break down a little bit. So just like backing it up a step then to understanding. So we basically have, okay, before getting into understanding, let's just like say for now, just for now, for state of mind, it's really about thrownness. So like on 177, he says, and it's in the italics, right? It's always beneficial to read the italics at least, right? Existentially, a state of mind implies a disclosive submission to the world, out of which we can encounter something that matters to us. Indeed, from the ontological point of view, we must, as a general principle, leave the primary discovery of the world to bare mood, saying that there is no discovery of the world, there is no encounter of the world without mood, right? And the way that we were talking about, the example I found illuminating for this is the basic attitudinal orientation that one can have that will strongly predict political affiliation, right? So if you have a baseline assumption that people are out to get you, or that the world is inherently flawed, then, and George Lakoff talks a lot about this, then following from that, then you have, you usually have like a more authoritarian state, the prerogative of which would be security and protection over other freedoms even. Whereas if you lean the other way, if you have like this more hopeful, optimistic view of humanity, then you might say, well, really, maybe a lot of the problems we're seeing with people are the fault of that authoritarian state, or the fault of certain structures. And then if we can like change those, we'll be able to, and then it will advocate for like a more nurturant model.
So okay, well, I just think that you need to
tie that into this.
Yeah, because that's.
I thought politics as well.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense, but why does, like, just to state it all simply, because it really can, I feel like, be stated simply. You have a state of being, like you find yourself in a sort of disposition, and it allows you to see certain things. You only see what that state of, well, not only, you can fight against a state of mind, and he says that on page 175.
We have to master our moods.
We have to master our moods, but you do it by way of a counter mood. You never do it by pure reason, you know. So you have a mood or a state of mind, and like it pushes certain things forward for you, right? And then in interpretation, you sort of are like, look at this thing. Well, you don't say it yet, but you just like have this thing and you understand it more. And an assertion is taking that interpretation and you pull out like one little bit, you know, and articulate it as an assertion by giving something a definite character. Like, that's pretty much it.
Well,
as far as
well, you said you'd simplify state of mind, and then you brought up all these other things. So
Simplify the whole connection.
no, it does. No, it totally does. I'm just giving you crap, but like I totally, yeah, absolutely. So, but I think we're all clear on that, right? So that makes enough sense then, as far as how state of mind, okay, would relate to that then. Yeah, no, that's a perfect example, and so anyway, then fear is his basic example, but that was in the previous reading. Now we're into understanding, and so with what you were just saying though, so you have understanding, and then you said interpretation, and then assertion. I think we have the chain of relations figured out. What's the difference, as far as everyone is aware, between understanding and interpretation?
Okay. Understanding and interpretation. So, hold on. I wrote, okay, there it is. He says it on page 189. He just says it straight up. Interpretation is the working out of possibilities projected in understanding. That's quite simply it. So like in an understanding of the world is sort of, I don't want to say based off of, but it's sort of one with a state of mind. So when you're in a state of fear, your understanding of the world is like, you're kind of scanning for things that are threatening, right? It's like allowing you to see threatening things. And then an interpretation is working out a possibility within that understanding of things. Like,
So what's an example of that?
oh, I don't know. I mean, maybe this would work. So say you're in a fearful state of mind and you're a kid in your bedroom at night and you see a coat hanging on like on the closet. It looks like a person. The interpretation might be like incorrect, but like you interpret that shape as a figure that's out to get you, right? Mm-hmm. And so then you might make an assertion or something to your mom that there's like a bad man in the closet. Like it all follows from the state of mind of fear. And you wouldn't have seen it if it was like, you know, daylight and you're feeling happy and like, or if you were just like not a fearful child, you know?
I think that makes sense.
It's scarier when there's a cowboy hat on top of the coat rack. Bad memories, man.
I know my parents had like the coat rack right at the bottom of the staircase. If you looked down at night, like you could see all the coats and all the hats, like because they hang on the hooks.
Oh, mine was in my bedroom.
Oh.
Coat rack in the corner, moonlight shining in through a cowboy hat on the top, so like a drapey coat, and it looked like a real silhouette. Terrifying stuff.
I like.
Maybe it was.
It wasn't. I checked.
I like the example Sammy used that it kind of it complements Lee Braver's example, because throughout Heidegger thinking on being, he uses examples of professors and students in classrooms and how they interpret that classroom differently, even though they have a fundamental shared understanding of what that place is for and and how to be in that place, right? So if you have this basic understanding of what a classroom is, it also invokes all sorts of things, perhaps memories of previous experiences in classrooms. But overall, though, you have like this preconceptual like know-how, which is to say ready to hand circumspective, like understanding of how to be in a classroom. You probably raise your hand. You probably like don't interrupt the teacher too much,
Unless it's your first day of college and you were homeschooled your whole life.
Or that.
Oh, you're not a favorite student on that day.
No, you're not.
No.
Just read the syllabus and quit asking questions.
I have funny stories about my brother being put in 5th grade after being homeschooled. But anyway, so keep going.
So then you also have because of your for the sake of which that has you there, say that it's to get a degree or because you're fascinated by Heidegger and you wanted to take the class for that reason, or whatever it is. You have interpretations of that are built on the understanding of what the classroom is. And that might be, okay, I am a student in this classroom. And then you might be like, I'm a go-getter student, or I'm a C gets degree student. Like you have all of these other interpretations that unfold. And then Sammy's example is like, then if there's a fire though,
I was right about saying what is the chair for when you're
right. What is the chair for? Well, you tell it.
So it is more if like you're a go-getter student, you usually go sit at the front, if your students get degrees, you go sit in the back. So like even in those contexts, chairs have slightly different meanings. But the chair is for sitting and listening. You go, you sit in the chair, there's the desk, you got your pencil, whatever. Like you just know to do that. But if there's a fire, then all of a sudden the chair is no longer something to sit. It's no longer like, imagine hyphens, something to sit in. It is now something to break with, and you throw it through the window to get out because your whole referential totality changed from I am a student in a classroom to I am a living being trying to survive a fire, and like anything goes so I can survive the fire. You switch sort of gestalts, like you switch to a different state of mind, like which is fear, survival. Well, not even fear, but like being on edge, survival from an attitude of like, oh, learning.
Yeah, and it's interesting that I'm glad you reminded me about that idea that we have to master our moods. I think he said in the context of growing up, to grow up, you have to master your moods, or maturity is the process of mastering moods. But we only do that with counter moods. And it seems like, well, that would mean that using the political example, if you're not going to be, if you're very ideologically oriented, ideas are powerful, like motivators in your life, they shape your action. Then if you don't have the checks and balances of counter moods given to you by other people who maybe they don't have the same uber suspicious view of the world that you do, their checks and balances can actually provide those kind of
Counter moods.
mood adjustments that would actually help you be a little bit more balanced, right?
Or understand.
I'm not sure if I like that interpretation.
You say you didn't like it?
No, that doesn't strike me as mastery of moods. It strikes me as an appeal to a neutral political, which mastery of moods doesn't strike me as a neutral mood. It strikes me as this idea of understanding your own moods. Like there's times where it's very good to be angry, right? And there's times where it's not good to be angry. And the key doesn't seem to be having it doesn't seem like when you're supposed to be angry to be able to make yourself happy. That doesn't make any sense. But rather to be able to control that anger in a certain way and not let it like drive you out of control.
Well, I mean,
so I don't like it. It just seems much different than the political example, where it doesn't strike me as mastery to simply to simply have the various checks and balances. Like that doesn't seem like a mastery of moods. That seems appealing to a certain political ideology that presupposes that checks and balances are good or something like that,
So,
which is itself a mood.
in my own, well, so I would agree with you, I think, completely, except that how I meant checks and balances wasn't to be taken in like a, I guess I'm not thinking how politics plays out too much in.
You're thinking
in
about
real
political
life.
beliefs.
Yeah, I'm thinking more like I'm thinking of I have specific examples of human beings in mind who they can't make sense of other worldviews as anything other than these people are just out to get us, or they're brainwashed by Satan, or like the liberal media, or whatever it is, and so like there's no actual well, just to say that, I'll just say that that's kind of where I was thinking, but I think that you're cutting to the point of like what he's actually trying to say here, which is more important than what I was trying to
Well,
say.
I just wonder if mixing ideology and moods really makes sense. Ideology strikes me perhaps more as understanding than it does as a mood.
People like Lakoff are arguing that the and then I was gonna just make sure you guys say whatever you're gonna say, Brian. But like people like George Lakoff, who Dave was talking about, are arguing that ideology arises out of a mood. Like the understanding of ideology can like be basically said to arise out of a certain orientation towards the world. And so like and I mean if you
I don't agree with that.
Well, right, but like, okay, so Dave and I both grew up in households where there's like a constant attitude of suspicion and fear. And
I get that.
Right, leaning like a certain type of ideology, political ideology, right? And then we have friends who just literally can't understand that because they grew up in this sort of attitude of like, well, everybody's out, like everybody's trying to do their best, and like it doesn't, it's okay, whatever you do is okay. And it was just like a totally different like way of living in the world. And maybe there's not a hard and fast correlation, but it kind of could serve as an example because like the only way that, I learned not to always be suspicious and like exactly like my parents had been. And like the only way I learned to really distance myself from their political ideology was by exposure to like people who had different orientations and learning to be like, maybe not in every case should one be suspicious and fearful. I know it's kind of a complicated example that probably doesn't make
Could I give a counterexample though as to why I think that political ideology has more to do with understanding than it does with mood?
Yeah.
Because I definitely understand where you're coming from, but I think to boil political ideology down to mood doesn't make any sense to me because like if you look on the right and the left on the center, there's all people who are highly suspicious in all of those camps, and that doesn't really come into their political ideology. Like I did my undergrad in political science, and the best indicator of someone's political ideology, of or not even political ideology, but of who someone is going to vote for, is who their parents voted for. Better than any other predictor. We can predict who someone will vote for based on who their parents voted for. And this strikes me as different than mood because sure, and I think that they're interconnected, but I think that if you're going towards politics with a certain mindset, politics is going to reinforce that mindset, right? That's the whole idea of like we go towards the world having already been with the world, and that shapes our interpretation of the world. So if we go towards the world, and it's the same with suspicion, but I don't like that direct correlation, and I don't think it's there between suspicion and like conservatism, or suspicion and like leftists who are conspiracy theorists. Like look at all the leftists who seem to think that George Bush knew about Osama bin Laden blowing up the Twin Towers. I know so many leftists who believe that, and it's ridiculous. Like, of course he didn't know that. So I think you have it on that, like, suspicion on both the left and right, and I think that it does tie into ideology in some way, but I think ideology also pushes that suspicion, and I don't think it's a one to the other relationship. I think that they're interconnected, and I think in that way we can understand. I don't know if we could call them distinct, because I think that there's a muddiness in Heidegger, but understanding and mood are distinct from one another, but they're impacting one another. They're in relationship.
I would just add that that I agree with that. I had added the clarifier, though, that for someone very ideologically motivated, ideas shape their actions. And I added that clarifier because most people aren't. I don't think. I don't think people are too terribly consumed by these things, and that a lot of people are Republicans because they come from Republican families, because they're not too there's just bigger things in their worlds that they care about, I think. But
I think
it's an oversimplification to say that that there's love, people guide their actions by love, or people guide their actions by fear. And obviously love and fear is all around and for everybody. And so it was really just to be more of an example playing off of a common trope, which is obviously not too helpful with in this case. So but as far as which comes first, that's the other problem, is so what you're raising is a good point.
Actually, I have
the question is that if there's an if they're equiprimordial understanding and state of mind with discourse, then there can't be a which came first, chicken or the egg. There is none of that.
Well, I think this gets at something that I was thinking about a lot in this chapter, and he talks about in the first instance quite a bit when he's critiquing substance ontology and traditional metaphysics. And at one point he says that in the first instance all there is Dasein, or something along those lines, which I found really interesting. So he's critiquing this idea of metaphysics looking for things as they are in the first instance, because for Heidegger that's meaningless. Who cares what language is in its first instance? We're interested in what language is now. And understanding language in the first instance doesn't make any sense for interpreting the existential, I guess, interpretation of Dasein, of language by Dasein today. So I think this is a.
You just said at the beginning of this chapter.
I can look it up in my notes. What do you want in particular?
Well, I just wanted to make note of it to look at it later. It doesn't matter too much. I just didn't remember him saying that it didn't matter about how language came about. Is that what you're saying?
No, I don't think he says that directly.
Okay.
But he says something about searching for language in the first instance. I can't remember exactly what he says about it, but he talks about other things and how philosophy looks for them in the first instance, and which is looking for them present at hand. It looks for them in the first instance present at hand in order to explain them, right? And we can see this in philosophy. It looks for what the essence of things is, and that's a look for the origin of the thing most of the time in the first instance. That just struck out to me because I took a class on Lareulle, and Lareulle is all about looking at things in the last instance. So it was interesting. Heidegger is trying to look at them kind of in the middle, where they are for Dasein.
Right, he's not trying to boil it all down to some first mover, right? That everything else unfolds.
He's looking at where we are, or trying to.
I've been really curious about the relation here between Lareulle and Heidegger, but I haven't really read him, so I can't.
Well, if you're interested, you should read Galloway's book on Lareulle, because he does talk about Heidegger a little bit in there. He presents Heidegger as a thinker of immanence, he suggests that you can read Heidegger either as a thinker of transcendence or immanence, and he talks about some of the ways that you could talk about Heidegger as a thinker of immanence in there in relation to Lareulle.
Sorry, Rascal just started crying in his jail over there, and so we forgot that he was in there. So now,
he was in there.
Oh, I forgot.
No, I didn't. He was in his own kind of prison.
Okay, so that's interesting though. Could you just share the last name of that author in the chat box?
Galloway.
Oh, just Galloway.
Yeah, Galloway.
Don't scratch.
So I was thinking, okay, maybe we could move to a new bit.
yeah, let's move to a new thing. Well, let's move into assertion, right? Is everyone comfortable with assertion? Oh, and I'll just share what I talked about in the Facebook message group. For one, because Ty didn't see it, and two, because anyone who's watching this later obviously probably wasn't in that group. And so, and that was just to put forward the idea that with the for having, foresight, and for conception discussed on page 191, right? This is the force structure of understanding. Which Braver said is not too important, and I'd always been so confused by it. I hadn't really thought too much about it. But I was like, oh my gosh, maybe this correlates, though, to the three modes of being. We have readiness to hand, present at hand, and then we have Dasein, or existence. And so anyway, just the understanding is going to have, there's going to be a pre-ontological understanding of all three of those moods that allows any subsequent interpretations to form, and so for having would be in relation to readiness to hand or circumspection. The for having is the know-how of how to go about one's daily dealings, and then the foresight would be we've become accustomed to seeing something as present at hand. So it's sight, it's presence, you're seeing it. And then for conception would be, I guess, that was kind of my thing, was like, well, I don't know if for conception is the best way of, would that correlate to Dasein, the kinds of beings who have existence or whatever. I don't know, but it was what I was thinking through.
That might be a stretch. The foreconception always worked for me. It's like, not that I necessarily understand the foreconception. I just reading through where it first comes up. One, it seems like foreconception is the least defined of all of them. It says, in either case, the interpretation is already decided for a definite way of conceiving it, either with finality or with reservations. This ground in conception. Not that I entirely understand that at this point, but to then, I don't know that it's worth our while to spend too much time wondering how much that has to do with the great split up in types of being and whether or not that might be Dasein.
I think you're right, but I'll just highlight the sentence before that in interpretation, we can either be interpreting. I'll just read it. In such an interpretation, the way in which the entity we are interpreting is to be conceived can be drawn from the entity itself, or the interpretation can force the entity into concepts to which it is opposed in its manner of being. And this is definitely his concern for Dasein, and for as being conflated with presence at hand ontology, right? That's the introduction one. And he talks a lot about that being one of the pressing things. Is that we have interpreted ourselves and the rest of the ways of being as somehow analogous to presence at hand.
So Jacob brought up this thing. I don't know.
Oh, is this just the? But it's
No. This is not the Lareulle thing. This is on for having.
It's just a blog post that talks about the three. I don't know. I didn't read it. I just Googled and found it.
Oh, cool. I will check it out. Check it out after. I will read the whole thing out loud right now.
The first step then is the guiding climate.
Cool. I'll look into that. Anyway, you're right that it's not too important. I did want to just.
Just curious.
I'm curious.
Maybe I'll stew on that for a little bit.
Yeah. Cool. So, I mean, but really, what's the point of the force structure of understanding?
That we have.
Right. How is understanding being used here different than how understanding is typically used, is another way of saying it.
As in, like, understanding is typically used in the sense that, like, just because we understand the world that we're encountering versus understanding the world and all its potentialities. That seems to be what the force structure is like being able to see out in advance how our being interacts with everything or what its potentials are. Does that kind of fit into
so
how that makes sense to you?
Yeah, he definitely says on 188 that as understanding, Dasein projects its being upon possibilities, right? And then on the next page, as Sammy points out, that interpretation is the working out of these possibilities. So it's like, I mean, we don't understand the pen as anything more than its possible ways of being, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's totally right. Now,
right, because you don't buy pens just because you see pens and go, pens, right? Like you buy pens because there's a definite purpose for getting those pens, which is not keeping them in their box, right? It's taking them out of the box and writing in a notebook with them,
right.
Which would, to me, as far as I'm understanding, is what really like that foresight is like having the foresight, like I'm going to need pens later.
When you've had,
right?
I don't think that's it. I think that so understanding in Heidegger is contrasted to like understanding in Logos, I think. This is how I would suggest, and like when we're typically talking about understanding in like a scientific or philosophical approach, it's like I understand the concept because I understand everything about it. So I understand water as being a molecular compound of hydrogen and oxygen. I can study that thing in order to understand it. Whereas I think for having is understanding of how they understands water as this thing I drink. It seems to make me feel better when I'm thirsty if I drink it. So I go towards the water having already been with the water. I don't think it has anything to do with like planning. I think it has to do with everydayness and being in the world.
Well,
Not that planning is necessarily, like it's not necessarily conscious. Like I know I'm going to need this, but in the sense that I already know what all of the possible uses for a pen could be.
It's the word "all" that I'm getting caught up on when you say this, because it's not so open-ended.
I guess not.
I think that this is last time I made the analogy that Jim Morrison talked about Potter throwing us onto the wheel. So I'm taking the Doors metaphor to another extreme with the guitarist Robbie Krieger, okay? And I'm thinking that Robbie is the sign, and Robbie has a mood that preconceives an understanding of music, okay? Music is a thing, and we know what music is. I don't know how we know what music is, and we have all sorts of different interpretations of it. But Robbie decides that he wants to make music, enjoy music. He's not even too sure which. But let's say that he starts down a road, and we all know this road. And this is the only reason why I'm using this to quote Dave as a trope. is Robbie wants to make music. He happens to have decided that a guitar can make music. Okay, we're all still pretty much in agreement with that. And we know that just an acoustic guitar of various designs can make various sounds. And those sounds, through the interpretation of the design, making the chording, interprets the design's mood and creates a series of music. So when I read through this, then I started to talk about assertions and things like that, and interpretations, okay, understanding. It's like, well, okay, so there's one way to do it with an acoustic guitar, but that's not the only way to, as I phrase things, watch out for my cat, skin a cat. Okay. If you go to the extreme of an electric guitar synthesizer, you can synthesize the guitar, you can synthesize the sounds, and you can use assertions as filters to affect how your mood produces something that others then experience. And they'll have their own mood, right? Presumably they came with a mood of wanting to listen to you play, but they may not. And you don't know that. And you're, gosh, I'm hoping that my mood is conveyed somehow through this piece of music that I'm creating using all of these assertions. And then as soon as you walk into the studio the next day, you have an entirely different mood, and you go and you walk up and you pick a different guitar and a different set of filters.
So so you're saying that the mood determines the well that's really interesting because you're relating it also to equipment, like choice of equipment. But yeah,
they're all filters, right? We're running filters through our head, and we're using tools, things ready at hand, to make that noise which we define as the music that we want to convey. And the only reason why I say this is that I had no idea how electrical amplifiers and effects boxes and any of that stuff worked. But I had heard sounds. Said, I want to make that sound. Boy, I'll tell you what, you know, how do you describe to somebody else, I want to make that sound? Well, you can if you have it, play it back. If you don't have it to play back, how do you explain to somebody else that twangy wild western sound of Hank Williams on this certain song? I can't.
Yeah.
But when you hear it, you know right what it is.
So there's an element of recognition because you can't. It's not like you can go and be like, well, if you have this, like no one describes it this way. They're not like if you have this specific amplifier and you turn these knobs to all these degrees and you play this chord and move your hand exactly this way. That's the sound I'm talking about. No, because
nobody has a formula.
No, because it's just like it's a recognition of like another instance of like a prior or a prior experience of that.
So I saw this area as equipping Dasein with the biological mechanisms necessary to filter crap out. You know, and he even gives you 3 assertions. There's different ways that you can filter that stuff out. That affects your understanding. And then when you talk to somebody else about it or you run it through your filters, you get an interpretation of it. So no matter what I hear you tell me, I run it through all of my filters and I spit it back to you, and it's not quite the same thing.
I wanted to point out actually with the assertion thing.
No, that's
no, it was really was good. I just wanted to point out with assertion something.
Well, and I also want to just like posit a question about understanding. So like I don't know which should come first because we should spend some time on assertion, but to get off of understanding, I'm curious about like.
It was just a correction.
Okay. Oh, then do that.
But
because I wondered if articulation was a better way.
I think articulation is probably a better way of saying what you're saying because assertion has like specific things.
It seems to be more technical and relating to true states.
So here on page.
Maybe. I'm not sure though.
On page 196, there's not 3 types of assertion. It's
on what page?
196. There's not three types of assertion. It's the three things that assertion means altogether. So assertion is pointing out.
Significations, right?
Yeah. So the primary signification of assertion is pointing out. So you are pointing out, and this is Jacob where I got. This is where I got like, and I know you said that representation could be just a type of assertion, but what gave me that like weird feeling was this first paragraph here where he says that even if this entity is not close enough to be grasped and seen, this pointing out has in view the entity itself and not, let us say, a mere representation of it.
The first paragraph?
No, the one with the number 1 by it.
Oh, okay.
Neither something merely represented nor the psychical condition in which the person who makes the assertion represents it. But yeah, so there's 3 elements to assertion. There's not 3 types of assertion. That was literally the only.
And that's what gave me the best analogy to an amplifier.
Mm-hmm.
So on the amplifier, there's this knob, presence. What's that mean? Well, when you do this thing and twist that knob, it points out a certain amount of sound. It provides a presence to it. Assertion is predication. So you can assert with a different knob. You can assert, I want to emphasize the front end of the attack on a note versus the decay on the back end.
Mm.
No, and what you're getting at. So I've been thinking in terms of like language. The first time I was reading this, and then reading through it again, I was thinking more like in terms of television, right? Because I mean, language was always the first thing I was going. But then I was thinking about, how do you influence other people's moods using these things? Because if you can, assertion is really the act of picking out pieces from a whole, and then putting them into your own linear chain, and then saying this represents the whole, right? And you're saying that the amplifier helps you
It's your set of filters.
hone in on and amplify parts of something that's already there, then that totally makes sense to me. So, but the interesting part though is that it's like with the word understanding here, another way that it's going against the traditional and even colloquial ways of understanding is that you already understand everything according to Heidegger. Does that make sense to you? It seems like we learn about things or confront things that we don't understand all the time. Does that pose a problem?
He doesn't say you understand everything. No. The they understands everything, as in idle talk and curiosity. This is getting into the idle talk, curiosity, ambiguity part, because like there's this ambiguous like sense of like understanding everything, or that everything is understandable, and that it can all be sort of like boiled down to this sort of like common sense thing. We come at the world with an understanding. That doesn't mean we understand everything. And then I don't remember when in the last reading, but there was this point where he mentioned when we come up against something with which we are not familiar with, which we don't understand, there's this other, I think it was when he was talking about fear, because generally like fear is this, but then if it happens in a domain where you have like no understanding, then there's this other element added, which is something. So,
and I think that in my analogy, what I expect to hear is the Heideggerian flaw is, do we understand this?
Do you understand what?
Do we have an
Do we
understanding
understand
of music?
I think that's a presumption on my part, that I think you could go down a rabbit hole for hours and hours and talk about what is music and how do we understand music and yada, yada, yada. But I think that in the bigger reference that Heidegger was talking about, we do understand music. Kind of like we understand light and dark and fear and pleasure.
Well, even if you get into the
I think Heidegger would agree with that, actually.
Well, yeah, I mean, and if you get into the whole idea that like that they understands music in a general way, whereas someone who's very like, technically like who studied music for a long, long time. Well, everybody kind of understands music, right? But I think someone who studies music realizes how little they truly understand music the more they study it. That's the whole point of this whole, like, the ambiguity, I don't talk curiosity thing, is like they kind of understand everything. It's sort of just like, that's that, that's that, that's that, that's that. And then but no one is encouraged, and that sort of thing discourages asking the fundamental questions, like, that break things down. Like, imagine you're at a performance, and someone stands up and they're like, guys, stop. What is music? And then they want to have a philosophical conversation. Everyone's going to be like, you are not going with the flow. You're not part of this crowd. Like, get out of here. And so
you'd say that even if you were in a classroom setting. I had a professor one day, first day of class, walks in, looks straight at my friend who's sitting next to me. What is poetry? Go. Never felt more quiet and tiny in my whole life. Because who the fuck knows? Like, how do you articulate? And you don't. People are trying to articulate what that is for a long time, the same way music is. But the only way we end up articulating it, to try and maybe get back a little bit, is through presence at hand, like analyses, right? It's a thing. A poem is lineated. Oftentimes it has this many feet, but sometimes it does, and then you end up just with this convoluted mess that really hasn't solved it anything.
There's really two things I wanted to say. Two things about that. One, I misstated that. Like I said, we already understand, everything. There were a few quotes that kind of give me this idea that he's saying something along those lines. But really, it's more like anything that we can interpret, we already understand, right? He does say that on 188, and that's where I was getting confused. But he says, the understanding appropriates understandingly that which is understood by it. In interpretation, understanding does not become something different. It becomes itself. Such interpretation is grounded existentially in understanding. And then, on the next page, he talks about how this is like a working out of possibilities. And I was just thinking about the ways that you're all talking about it and trying to think, like, how to make this make sense with that. And I think that so we understand what poetry is if we've been introduced.
If we're interpreting.
Could I interject for a second?
Yeah.
I think part of the problem is that we constantly fall back into understanding as we typically understand it, right? We typically think about understanding as knowing a thing in like a technical or a colloquial sense. Like, I know this thing. Like, I know what water is. I know what this book is. I know what Deleuze writes about. I know what happens in Harry Potter. And I think the word understanding makes us constantly fall back into that mode of understanding, or that mode of thinking about understanding. But I think like Peter Sloterdijk at the beginning of the Globes trilogy has this really good example of what being with means and how that shapes understanding. And he has this example of the mother with the child. So as a child, you in the womb, you are always already with. So you always already have this understanding of closeness with this other. But that's not an understanding. You don't know what closeness means. You don't know what a mother it means in terms of any sort of, like, you can't define it. You don't have any sort of definition. You don't know it in the sense that we usually think about knowledge, but you have this experience of being with this thing. You have this closeness. And Sloterdijk suggests that this shapes our whole experience, and he like his project's really trying to get rid of individualism, but it's this way that in our very being we have this baseline thing that it's so tough to talk about using language, and that's why when we turn it into language, it constantly goes back into like logos and the image of thought and representation or presence at hand, we constantly fall back into that because it's so difficult to talk about this understanding that isn't actually understanding like a cognitive, definitive understanding. It should, like, see, again, it's hard to even talk about it because I'm falling back into, like, it is cognitive. Like, I have, it's in my brain, it's in my existence, but it's not something I can even need to be able to talk about. So something like music, I think, is a really good example because, like, I don't understand it I have some understanding of musical technicality, but I don't really understand it technically. But I understand my experience of music in the way Heidegger says, and it's that experience of things. And so understanding is not something that we can, like, define. Like, it's not being able to define things, because that's moving back into presence of hand. So it's not like, understanding everything doesn't mean that the they has an explanation for everything. It simply means that the they has been with everything and goes towards everything on the basis of having already been with, right? So I was thinking, he said, when he's talking about hearing, he's like, you can't hear something you don't understand, right? You don't hear, and I don't know if he says this or I read into it, you don't hear like a multiplicity of chaos. You only hear things you understand. But that doesn't mean we don't hear things we don't understand in the presence at hand mode, right? Because I can hear something and say, I don't understand what I just heard, but I heard something. And that's an understanding of that thing, right? Right? Because it's having been with that thing, I've heard something I don't understand. Like, something I don't understand is that thing that I understand.
Well, right, because there's the conflation of those terms again. You don't have you don't really have a framework that you can put that thing you heard into, but you understand that you have an experience of it. And I thought poetry was also a really interesting thing to talk about it, because I don't know, I was just trying to find it, and I can't find it. And I'm really, really hangry, and so I'm sorry if I'm being irritable.
We've got chili coming.
Okay, I'm sorry. My mood is like, it's just irritability in general, and I know it's because I'm hungry. So I'm sorry if that's coming across. I don't want it to. But anyway, so like poetry though is really interesting because you're talking about analyzing a poem with language, with assertions. That implies that like the poem is something other than just like the assertions of language, and it is, because Dave and I were talking about this earlier. You don't, like, if you want to make someone enter into the state of being, the sort of mood. That's kind of the purpose of a poem, is pulling someone into a mood. You don't just go like, okay, well, if I describe everything accurately, then they'll be able to process all of that and then like see where I'm at and then get into that mood. No, like you come at it slant, like we were saying the other day. Like,
well, that's only if you're talking about lyric poetry.
That's true. I'm not talking about epic poetry.
That's where the conversation always gets complicated. How do we?
Well, and
there is still that sense.
There is still a sense of like, what's his face? Homer. Is it Homer? No, who wrote the Odyssey? It's Homer, right?
Homer.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, probably not.
Well,
but Homer's who we call.
Okay, but like, instead of describing like the exact state of the dawn every time it happens, it's always the rosy fingers of dawn. Like, there's just like a certain like lyricism even in poetry that's meant to do something else. Okay.
And also just by the fact that particularly all epic poetry or poetry that came about pre-18th century was written in metrical verse, had a musicality to it, because even though it's describing events in pretty clear detail, like it's relying on the music to carry it, right?
Carry the atmosphere.
So are all of these mood, understanding, like, okay, so now those two, it's very clear, like they're pre-linguistic states, right? Discourse too also seems like a pre-linguistic state, even though we want to call it linguistic, because even like he's talking about the hammer at the one point, and literally dropping the hammer is a discourse of that hammer being not ready to hand, right? Like it's too heavy and just throwing it away, right? And that's a discourse between
That was
two.
a discourse, really.
I think I'd have to find that.
See,
But so if it's not pre-linguistic, how's it fit in?
No, but this is the important part here. Just remember that language and talk. He says that the existential ontological foundation of language is discourse or talk, and then part of this is like being with, right? And so discourse is beyond. It doesn't just have to be talking. It's ways that the being with is signaled and shown, like brought to the fore. We always kind of know we're with, but discourse brings that being with to the fore.
You can come into a co-state of mind, a mit something in German. That's what being with. Okay, so it's page 205. I really just like the German word Mitbefindlichkeit because it's like with, like being found with in this sort of state. I don't know, like you're being found in the state together, right? So the articulation in this more general. Okay, wait. The phenomenon of communication. He's trying to understand it in an ontologically broad way. Communication in which one makes assertions, giving information, for instance, is a special case of that communication which is grasped in principle existentially. So assertion is one type of communication, right, which is like being with each other, or understandingly the articulation of being. I would just be careful not to say discourse, because discourse is, where did it go? Gerede, like, is the word for idle talk, and like rede is the word for discourse or talk. And in the footnote, the translator said there's no real good translation for it because it's like a mixture of discourse and talk. It's not just communication at large. But you're right that that communication.
Well, discourse is what he's using for communication. If I'm not mistaken, I mean, literally it says in italics when he's introducing language and discourse at the beginning of this. Discourse is existentially equiprimordial, a state of mind and understanding. That's what here on 203. That's how he's using discourse.
Right. So like this is the trifold, phenomenon here where we have them all working with one another. Discourse is on the same level. So actually, I'll share that with. I don't know if this. Does that work?
It's backwards.
Oh, it's backwards?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, I can just point and say that here we have discourse, state of mind, and understanding. The three are equiprimordial, right, as being in the world. And then from those come more derivative things. But, I mean, it's not too important.
Right, and he's equating, or there seems to be at least the confusion between communication and discourse, because he says in the introduction, everything before he really hits on the discourse, he says in the middle of this paragraph in section 34, and clarifying the third signification of assertion as communication speaking forth. Oh, never mind.
So assertion is derivative of these three phenomena.
Right.
So it's like you have a state of mind that reveals the world in a certain way and makes certain things intelligible, and then you understand that intelligibility is this basic understanding that they can interpret it with others through discourse. But then that's going to be speech acts and such that follow from the being with part of the discourse that's prior to.
Yeah,
right? Because it's not our language, it's not my language, it's our language, and so that the language with its preconceptions embedded in its words is part of a discourse that precedes my existence in this world, probably.
Discourse is okay. It's the sentence that spans 203 and 204. Discourse is the articulation of intelligibility. So
right.
It underlies interpretation and assertion. And so interpretation, because it doesn't necessarily have to be a linguistic like assertion, I think you could say in a sense that discourse has those elements that are not purely verbal, right? Because where's that part where he says the thing about?
There's literally a part about a hammer and a.
Oh yeah. He used that reference several times.
Uses it a few
about the
times.
hammer
Well, I
being too
mean,
heavy.
throughout the whole book.
Yeah.
There's hammers on every page. But specifically in this one about dropping a hammer because it's too heavy and just explaining too heavy, kind of like caveman style, like that is. I know I put a little exclamation point there.
I mean, you could grunt in disgust and then go for a
Even
different
that
one.
alone,
That
right?
would still
And I think he even says that, but I don't want to.
Yeah, it's in here.
Okay, so long as we all remember it.
Okay, but to clarify all of this, I think 206 is helpful. Because look at this paragraph that starts with the word attempts. Attempts to grasp the essence of language have always taken their orientation from one or another of these items. Whatever those items were. So the idea of expression, of symbolic form of communication as assertion, the making known of experience, the patterning of life. And he's like, even if you put all of these sort of things together in a syncretistic fashion, nothing would be achieved in the way of a fully adequate definition of language. So he's not restricting language to symbolic form. He's, I think language is communication in a sense. That's really interesting.
That's what I felt he was saying as far as discourse goes.
Well,
any sort of communication, like the root of discourse is nonverbal.
Also,
and then we get assertions out of that.
That's kind of why I thought about discourse as like mediation.
Mm-hmm.
There's also two quotes that are coming to mind. One at the end of chapter 4 when he said that upon the referential totalities of signification is founded the being of words and language. So referential totalities of signification, the being of words and signs or whatever is founded on those referential totalities, right? I mean, I think that Saussure would agree. And that then in this one, he had said that to significations words accrue. Mm-hmm. So that's just to say that these referential totalities that are ready to hand and always like related to us in meaningful ways precede all of the attempts to put words to them. So
right.
I mean, it totally makes sense. The one thing I found the quote that Sammy was looking for, about poetry, and I wrote I got really excited about this because I didn't really understand it last time, and so reading it this time it was like, oh, okay. So I did want to touch on that at the bottom of 205. The reason I find this so interesting is because I really like the question concerning technology, and at the end of that essay, he really kind of like lays out. Well, he doesn't really lay it out, but he kind of just says that the saving power within the problem at hand is in poiesis, and which
is poetic making.
Yeah, which is going to be just creation at a level more ontological than just poetry, but it includes poetry, and so his turn went towards poetry, and so this part was important because of that. And I've also just like been wondering since the question concerning technology, why? Like, I mean, he can say it, and in that essay he says it, but he doesn't really do anything to show why he thinks that is the case. And he, a nugget of it, or a seed of that is right here. So he says in poetical discourse at the bottom of 205, in poetical discourse, the communication of the existential possibilities of one's, and I can't eat either right now, so I'm super full. Thank you. I will eat after though. But in poetical discourse, the communication of the existential possibility of one's state of mind can become an aim in itself, and this amounts to disclosing of existence. Now, whereas assertion the logos is typically working in a way where it's taking from the referential whole of significance, and then it's taking those bits and then putting them into linear sequences and saying this is that, drawing that connection, and then giving you these impressions of what being is that way, and always for the sake of which, always for the sake of which, right? Any discovery made in biology is driven by certain for the sake of whiches. Like every positivistic science has its founding questions or domain that carve out domains of being. And he's saying that poetry has the possibility. He doesn't say all poetry does this. He just says that it can. Poetry can have as its aim state of mind first and foremost, and that in that possibility, we are. Oh, sorry, I lost my quote. But in that possibility, this amounts to disclosing of existence. And existence, remember, is the word that he's specially reserved for Dasein at the beginning of the first chapter. And so it's like, so really, like at this point, besides philosophy, besides the possibility of philosophy, poetry has the possibility of talking about the kind of being that is particular to us.
And poetry's been doing it better over the long run than philosophy. Just kidding.
Yeah,
he might agree with you.
Maybe. I don't know if I agree with me.
I agree.
I don't have a stance at this moment in time. I'll tell you later.
I'll tell you 20 years.
Yeah, I'm 14.
Thanks for the chili, Denise.
You're very welcome.
It sure smells good.
It is.
I will now be a nicer human.
So Sammy got herself a big bowl of mood adjustment.
Yes. Managing my moods by meeting my needs.
Sometimes we smoke bowls of mood adjustment. Sometimes we eat
Dave, this
bowls
is
of
going
mood
on
adjustment.
YouTube.
Need some fix-
I don't smoke bowls of mood adjustments ever.
I don't either.
Actually, that's true. I don't have to say it. Everyone knows.
We theoretically could be more organized.
Well, I mean, okay. So I said the thing about poetry. I think that means, unless someone wants to respond to that, like
Poetry's good. We're all in agreement on that. Poetry's good.
Let's
Right.
move into questions.
The world is not
No. The world thinks that poetry's questionable, just like good architecture or good music.
I think it's a waste of time. It's not
Anything
a matter of
besides money.
questionability. I don't.
Money's the only value because it's the only thing without value.
Right.
It's weird.
Well, it's funny because in the question concerning technology, part of the whole point is that whatever doesn't fit within the referential grid of intelligibility set out by the essence of technology, which is basically capitalism.
I think it's money.
And basically money, yeah. Whatever doesn't fit within that grid is going to become non-existent.
I mean,
It's
if there was a clause,
Kind of like
add the A to stem.
Stem?
Steam.
Stemma?
No, add the A to stem.
Steam.
Then it becomes steam. When you have something useful.
Well, it depends on where you're supposed to
steam
put
ahead.
the A.
The art. But I wanted to say actually, so
Astem?
I might find the A.
Satum?
Sorry.
sorry.
Food showed up
Myself.
and started goofing. That's
Well, I was gonna actually just say though that like really quickly, if you like Charles Eisenstein or not like he's a theorist that people have reverence for or something, but I think he's got a useful perspective. And he just puts it, he says the converting of social, intellectual, creative, material being into capital. So it's like a sort of conversion machine that takes like all these things, sees them as resources and like spits out capital. And that like if we don't see the limits of that, and reframe how capital works in the world, then we're just going to run out of things to convert into capital. And then like capital just collapses because it's really nothing. It's like it's not really nothing. It's like it's a useful symbolic belief for up to a point. But anyways, that's what inframing made me think of. And now we can get back to being in time.
So Lydia messaged the group and won't be able to join. Okay. I think at this point I don't know, I feel pretty comfortable with the section A of this chapter. section B was, according to a couple of people, more fun. So does anybody have anything they want to share from that, or questions, or
From
quotes?
final reflections on
I
chapter.
think section B is saying things that are potentially more controversial. Therefore, it's kind of more fun to read.
Yeah, let's do that.
Because one thing maybe I want to address, and maybe we already have, is I guess I don't buy it that he's trying to say something without like ethical implications.
Yeah.
That just seems like bullshit. And I don't know if it's worth spending our time with. Like, I'm fine with it if he is, because, or is it that I'm just drawing all of these connections because that's the way they tell me to?
Well, he uses language that is clearly charged. He uses fallenness.
But is it clear?
No, but it is. Fallenness is clearly charged in Christianity, and alienation, which is clearly charged in Marxism. And he also uses tempting and what's the other one? The tranquilizing.
Yeah.
Which are all pretty charged words, no matter, like, from different perspectives. So, like, alienation is the one that really struck out to me, and he only uses it like 2 or 3 times, and I was like, why is he talking about alienation for?
I wanted to say though, idle talk. I think the negative association with that one has mostly to do with the difficulty of translating Derrida into English. It's just what the translators say.
Are you sure? Because the first sentence of that is the expression idle talk is not to be used here in a disparaging signification. Like, he was kind of preempting that people go, you're kind of like just shitting on everyone for idle talking all the time.
Yeah. Well, I think he was making it extra clear because, like, let's just say it said small talk instead, and that's a little less disparaging sounding than idle talk. But you can take it as like, okay, something you learn when you go to a different country. Small talk's great. Small talk is a really good thing. So if you don't really know the language, like, it's your saving grace for not feeling like a complete outsider, and it like helps you connect with people, right? So you could be like, okay, I'm gonna use this term small talk, and I don't mean that in a bad way. But idle talk just sounds even more disparaging.
Yeah, or is it that it's becoming even more of a focal point in my mind because he keeps saying, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing, instead of just doing it? Because, yes, like, as I was reading, I was like, okay, we're not going to think of idle talk as disparaging, just like trying to understand it for what it is. You know, is he right? Is this making sense? Yes, absolutely. This is something we all do. We sit around and we shoot the shit, right? And then we pass on information through that process of just like, oh, so-and-so told me such and such, now I'm going to tell you, and you're going to go tell such and such, like the telephone game as it is, and just taking it at face value and just moving through it without actually examining it, right? And I'm like, yeah, we do that. Or
perhaps he's messing with us. Perhaps he's messing with us, right? Because his whole philosophy is based on we go towards things having already been with them. So I'm going to use this language that you've already been with and use it in a completely different way to jar your understanding of that language.
Which he already does in other ways.
With other words, every word, all words.
And I mean, I think like, yeah, falling and temptation and tranquilization all are pretty charged, but at the same time, they're really good at describing like what's going on, you know? Like
I'm not sure about fallenness, because that one confused me more than the other ones, I think. Perhaps alienation as well. Because fallenness seems to imply fallen from somewhere. But he doesn't seem to mean that. And so fallenness kind of is confusing to me just for that reason.
I think it's okay. I think it makes sense to me because I think of thrownness. So I think if you're the thing being thrown, you're falling. It doesn't mean you came from some pure state. You just exist.
Yeah, like, but why that? Why? Because we're thrown and falling? Like, that still doesn't really solve.
There's still like the metaphorical hierarchy there that exists.
I see. I understand thrownness a lot better than fallenness.
Maybe he spent too much time in seminary.
So I think that I've got a hunch it can't be an accident that he's trying to use some Christian language, and that he is at this point in his life, I think, pretty like against Catholicism. I mean, he has a special place in his heart for traditions, but he's not like, he's an atheist though. And that, man, it's just that, like, did he want to appropriate these words for some reason? I can't read too much into like why he would have wanted to interpret fallingness, but he does specifically say this invokes like the idea that you're falling from somewhere. Don't let it. And then he says, you know, that this might make people think that it has something to do with like a sort of intrinsic corruption in man. Don't let it do that either.
Right. And he does clearly say how not to read it.
Yeah.
And on 220 clarifies a little more too, saying the idea is rather that of falling at the world or collapsing against it.
Well, because it's not fallen in German. It's not just fallen. It's verfallen, which is like for fallen or something. It's like a different word that they translated simply as fallen.
Sure, as they have to.
See, I took this area to help explain the fact that we've got two different levels that we use language at. And in this case, we're going with the idle talk portion of it, which is, yes, I would like 3 eggs over easy, 2 strips of bacon, and a cup of coffee with cream. Okay? That's communication. It's important communication, but it's idle talk. Okay? It's feeding yourself. We're not talking about philosophy or anything like that. So it's functional talk that has to do with our existence. And then the fallen part of it I took as being, so we've accepted the fact that we've even got like a secondary form of communication, which works in particular in my referential relationship with they. So you talk about things with they differently than you talk with people about things that are not they. Okay, this discussion right here is a not fallen communication. We're trying to talk about something.
But we fall into it over and over.
Right. With the food and the beer, and you know, we always slip back into this kind of ooh.
Well, I think is it not
language, and you know, is it I'm thirsty, I'm going to go eat, you know, and we have to communicate that way with each other, and that's the ambiguity and the not so weightiness of the fact that we all have to communicate with each other.
Right.
But is there not also, and I think that's not wrong, is there also not the more subtle thing that's happening in the falling? Or even, I guess, idle talk could probably work for this, like within the context of this group, just relying on maybe what Dave says about what's in the text. Mm-hmm. Maybe I read through that page really quick and I don't really remember it, and I go, yep. That's what Heidegger said, right? Without actually going back, like examining, which is why, like, I think maybe that's a good reason why we put so much emphasis on the text. If we want to actually start to defend that a little more, is because, like, Dave can tell me all day long what Heidegger says, but until I not only read what he says, but reflect on it as whether or not it's actually ringing true or where there are faults in my authentic self, which we then get into, like, I haven't really engaged it at all.
And just, well, so again, authentic doesn't mean genuine. It doesn't mean necessarily true or like in accordance with one's essence or almost possibility necessarily. Authentic just means relating to oneself as oneself. Mm-hmm. But okay, so
to one's own most possibilities. And this is just really quick, like to throw in there that we're talking about the they is always carving up the world, interpreting it for us. And that's good. It's useful. Obviously, it's useful. You know, I don't.
We were talking about the other day with roads.
I don't want to invent my own hammers and build my own roads and all of this stuff every day, right? And so having like pre-established interpretations like enacted like is very useful. and it's a net positive. Like at least I would just say that just for the sake of argument. Like this is a good thing, but it's also like we have a tendency, a temptation to slip into kind of just taking the easy way, which is to say, like, I know exactly what I can do, and it's exactly what I'm supposed to do. As in, like, it's the thing that no one will like raise an eyebrow about. I could just like hide out and play video games. No one's gonna care. No one's gonna like. Well, actually, no, people might. So actually, that's wrong. But still,
I'm gonna just go study and be a businessman.
yes.
Yeah, I'll always be wary of the unanimous vote.
And also like the functionality of it is, think about it. We all have our own particular throne positions in the world with our own kinds of our own initial understanding. Let's just say that like, I've studied philosophy, you've studied poetry. How do we speak to each other? Except for assuming some they-ness, right? Like, and that's because we enter like the mainframe of universal signifiers. Like, we kind of like understand how to use those. I can talk about poetry with you. I have no idea about poetry though.
I
right?
wanted to actually say something because before I lose it, and I will lose it because this chili is really good. And that is when you said like there's this tendency to sort of like, I was thinking of leaning on the they. So falling against is more kind of just like letting yourself be supported by the they. It's not so much falling into a vat of they-ness, which is like insidious and gonna get you. It's more just like you're kind of like, whew, that was hard. I don't want to stand.
I was just gonna say that, right? Yeah.
And taking a stand. Then thinking about the German sense, like of falling against versus taking a stand. It's like you're either leaning on something or you're taking a stand.
In this case, I will not let you tell me how to think.
And the thing is, you have to lean against stuff sometimes. You get tired, and you need to.
Or there's just no point not to.
Right, but sometimes you do need to take a stand, and you need to be able to.
I don't need to take a stand on driving on the right-hand side of the road and stopping at stoplights.
No.
Right.
That's good.
It's just, I can do that, like, lights off, not even thinking, right? Just autopilot. I guess maybe I could take a stand, because I don't know, this is another thing I've been thinking about. I don't know that taking a stand necessarily means fundamentally forming a different opinion either, right? Because I could take a stand on driving, which is simply to say, why am I driving on the right side of the road? Because if I drive on the left, cars are going to ram into me, and then I become kind of cognizant of that reality. And instead of just following the herd, I'm like, oh, that's real. Okay, I'm just going to drive on the right side of the road.
You're like, I decided.
Because that will cause problems otherwise, right? And that's a really base, way to break it down, but we could do that. Like, okay, why do I vote this way because I've been told my whole life that this is just what's better for people? Okay, maybe I'll then take a stand on that and then decide, yeah, that's how I'm gonna vote no matter, anyway, right? But at least then there's a difference between now I'm no longer leaning and I've actually for myself just, decided or reflected on a thing as to how, this is the place where maybe I'm less able to articulate it, but how I actually feel or relate to a thing, right?
Excuse me.
So yeah, I guess it could easily be interpreted as taking a stand means just being different. No. I don't think that's the case at all.
Yeah, authenticity, this is the thing, it doesn't just mean being different. It does mean that sort of making it, this is sort of where I guess start maybe entered Heidegger's project and then ran with it. I don't know, it feels like this because it's there's this, there's these possibilities, these paths laid out for you. And it's still a choice. It's still a choice not to take any of them, right? But okay, let's just forget about sorry, never mind.
Just use it for your own self, yeah.
Just use it for your own self.
We're always choosing.
Right. You're okay, well there's 5 paths laid out for me, and there's this thing I could cut one through the bush, but I've heard this one's good, and I'm thinking about it, and I'm deciding to take that path instead of just everyone's going on the path, so you're just kind of walking away from the path, when it really could be leading off the cliff. There's a certain sense of reflection and choice. That's what authenticity means. It means making it one's own. It doesn't mean being different. Right,
because using Sartre's perfect because the classic example is between the the person who can join the resistance, I think to fight Nazis in this example, they can join the resistance, or they can take care of their mother who will die without them, right? The they actually in this case would be telling you, you should stay with your mother. The they is also telling you, you should go fight in the resistance with your comrades. In either case, like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. Their answers don't work for you, and no Kantian imperative is going to get you there.
Right, because there's nothing you'd say that everyone should do, and that's kind of the problem with the categorical period.
But with taking the stand, be like, I'll let my mom die and not join the resistance. I'm going to go like, no.
Could be.
I mean, I'd just say that it's a pretty shitty stand to take, but it could be.
Right, because if we're going to go with, I'm talking out of the room, go with it not being a moralizing thing, does the stand you take have to be a moral stand that's the best choice? So I guess if you wanted to say,
look at that discourse that just happened without any words. They frowned, and it made Brian switch coffee cups.
Pre-linguistic face making.
So do you guys have like Joel and Jacob, because we've been kind of just
Hogging this section.
Do you have any reflections, either of you, on section B? Or not section B, part B, whatever.
Or tell us something wrong.
I didn't find part B all that interesting, to be honest. I thought it was just kind of explaining what it was like to be in the everyday, and that I kind of just read it. I didn't spend as much time on it nearly as the first half, or part A, I guess. I don't know. I really like the last two paragraphs of the chapter, though, because for the first time, at least in my mind, he kind of sums up everything he did in the chapter very succinctly and nicely. And I thought that this chapter was probably the most well-organized of any of the chapters thus far, which made it the easiest to read. What he says, the leading question of this chapter has been about the being of the there. Our theme has been the ontological constitution of the disclosedness, which essentially belongs to Dasein. The being of that disclosedness is constituted by states of mind, understanding, and discourse, which we talked about near the beginning. An everyday kind of being is characterized by idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity, which are the different, I guess, modes or ways of everydayness. These show us the movement of falling with temptation, tranquilizing, alienation, and entanglement as its essential characteristics. So that kind of serves as like a summary of the whole thing, which I thought was quite helpful. And then he shows us, so kind of taking the Heideggerian mode, that's what we've come, that's our forehaving going forward, right? We've been with these concepts, and now he's summarizing them in order to project us into the future in the final paragraph. But with this analysis, the whole existential constitution of Dasein has been laid bare in its principal features, and we have obtained the phenomenal ground for a comprehensive interpretation of Dasein's being as care. So we get a brief glimpse into the next chapter of care as the being of Dasein. So the whole, I just really like that he sets it up like that, because you can kind of see his theory in the way he writes there, and I think it serves as a nice summary of everything that's come before in the chapter.
I love especially with these kinds of authors, continental thinkers, as I've encountered them so far. There's nothing like those. There's like these payload pages where they finally like pull all this like language they've been developing together, and then you're like, thanks.
For finally doing that.
There's also this thing that one of my professors once described, where he's like, there's times where all of a sudden it just clicks, where you've been like going through pages and pages, and then you'll just read like an offhand sentence and it will all suddenly make sense. And it's just like this random sentence where you're like, huh, that's what he's been talking about this whole time. And then it like shapes your whole understanding of what you just read. And it's like, I put in all that work and now it's like this puzzle that just kind of, you figure it out.
Yeah, and for people, at least I'll speak for myself, but people like me, there's like a selfish thing here well, I mean, like, you know, so analytic philosophers like to puzzle out things, you know, in clear language. And I like to puzzle out really incomprehensible texts for exactly that reason, exactly what you're talking about, because those breakthrough moments are like, oh, and then you go back and you reread parts and it's like, oh, it makes sense now. What this, you know, so I don't know. It's
You're the kind of person who would take on climbing a mountain because, like, you know, there's a sort of like sadistic. Or wait, what's that? What's self-inflicted pain? What's that? Sadomasochist. Masochist.
Maybe. I also no, totally. But like, I mean, just to also be like, well, I know you're joking. I was joking, but also just to be serious though, like, there's also like definite like they get pays dividends in so many ways. Like when you actually do it, I don't know, for me at least. So I wanted to touch on. Well, actually, it's 8:20. I thought for some reason I thought it was like almost over, and I was gonna start talking about chapter 6 and just like how we should think about it, give you a foreconception, because I read the introduction to chapter 6 by Lee Braver, and I'll just say this now instead of at the end. That way, if anyone drops out or leaves soon, then you'll know this. But focus on, I mean, according to Lee Braver, I'll just say that. According to Lee Braver, we need to be focusing on the first half of 6 more than the last half. I'm going to focus on all of it still, you know, kind of just like how we, you know, so Jacob was less interested in the last half of 5, more in the first half. You know, I think that both are great for their different reasons, and different people will have different opinions. But what Braver says about the last half of 5 is that it looks like it got tacked on there as something that was actually meant for Division 3 that kind of just got thrown in at the end of Division 1 because Division 3 never happened. And that these are like, that he starts doing all this stuff with truth and reality and these things that really don't get built on later in Division 2, but are instead built on in his later work, which is, you know, most of Division 3 gets built on in his later work, in that it was never written for this book.
I also wanted to say something that I just thought of, because it doesn't seem like, well, it's kind of open game, whatever. So this whole, like, what Brian brought up, you could just rely on Dave's interpretation of Heidegger, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or you could rely on Lee Braver's interpretation of Heidegger. And, like, but doing so is a sort of mode of, like, I guess, I don't know how to say this
It's
correctly.
leaning falling into the academic
It's
they.
falling against the academic they, and to let them support you, right? But until you have the strength to stand on your own 2 feet, until you've explored in enough areas to really actually take a stand, until you have read Heidegger multiple times, as I'm sure Lee Braver has done, then it's like, it makes sense to lean against them for now. But you just have to be conscious that you're doing it. And there's this phenomenon a lot of times.
Well, if you're conscious that you're doing it, they're falling.
Well, maybe not.
I guess that's one of the.
That's like a technical question of Heidegger's use of falling.
Right. Either way.
But like, there's a phenomenon that we were discussing the other night, which is that, like, there's this like thing that like academics like to do, especially graduate students, which is just like throw out names and ideas and to be like, oh, you know, so-and-so says this, and then so-and-so says that, so therefore that. And then, like, you can tell by the sort of superficiality of the way they present those ideas that they actually didn't read the text, or they just kind of got a brief survey of it.
They learned to skim in grad school.
Because grad school teaches you to do that, which is a huge, I think, problem for the university and for academia.
For life.
For life. You know, I can articulate
Well,
why.
I think skimming makes sense in certain discourses. It doesn't make sense in philosophy.
Right. I think that's fair.
That is fair. But
It makes
that's so
complete. If you've ever taken social science, it makes a ton of sense.
what?
In the sciences, skimming makes you have to skim everything, or else you'll be super bored.
Yeah.
You basically just read conclusions.
So also like getting back to the usefulness of the way that followingness is structured between ambiguity, idle talk, and curiosity, right? Which is like passive consumption of novelty. The use value there is like, I don't know if I should read Lareulle next or if I should read Baudrillard next. And I don't know if I should go back and read Kant instead. And I don't know if I should maybe I should go back to Parmenides, and it's very difficult knowing where to go next. You have like, maybe people say work with what's closest to you, but you're like, well, I could take like one of these 10 classes. Those are all closest to me. How am I supposed to decide? And so like the whole culture of people saying, name dropping, so-and-so would say this and so-and-so would say that. It's like, it's useful in that sense of like, it kind of gives you an idea of what direction you might want to head in, but we just have to be aware of that tendency, because we always fall back into that, speaking in these generalities, speaking in these stereotypes. And I do it all the freaking time. So
like there are times, and this is so Jacob, when you were saying that thing about political ideology earlier, about like prioritizing a sort of neutral, balanced political viewpoint, I was thinking about that language of balance that gets used a lot, and we could be like, well, you just need to strike a balance between like being careful and diving deep into the text and being like too analytical, and then just being really vague in general and like fallen and blah, blah, blah. But it's not so much about striking a balance between those two things as understanding when those different modes are necessary or useful or like valuable, right? So like sometimes it makes sense to lean against, to be in the mode of fallenness, even if that doesn't really mean if you're consciously choosing it. I don't know if it means you're in the mode of fallenness, but like it makes sense to rely on authority or hearsay. And then others, and you just have to recognize like, and it takes the cultivation of judgment, the ability to judge a situation. This is kind of Hannah Arendt's domain, right? To know when to take a stand and know when to lean, and to know when to be dependent and know when to be independent, like all those sorts of things. You have to cultivate your judgment, and that's kind of the whole point is like you have to make things your own so that you know when to allow yourself to fall or when to allow yourself to do this or when to restrict yourself. Like the art of living is kind of
isn't that moralizing Heidegger a little bit?
Yeah, but I think I have every right to moralize Heidegger. I'm not saying he's moralizing anything.
Yeah, he provides you a framework upon which you can moralize. Well,
okay, actually, so on page 224, the paragraph before the one you read, Jacob, he says that it follows that our existential ontological interpretation makes no ontical assertion about the corruption of human nature. Not because necessary evidence is lacking, but because the problematic of this interpretation is prior to any assertion about corruption or incorruption. And so basically, I think what he's saying here is that like there's these existential structures, and he's setting them forth. Do with that as you will, like interpret that the state of man as you will, to have a whatever conceptual understanding. But it's always going to come back to and rely on this ontological problematic that he's laying out. So if I like want to interpret and like pull out and then make an assertion that's sort of moralistic from Heidegger, I think the really important thing is that I just recognize that's not Heidegger. That's like something I'm laying out over Heidegger, but he is exposing this whole structure that I need to even make like a sort of moralizing assertion.
right. Crickets. Everyone, I guess, recess for a moment, look over your notes, see if there's any pressing things, and then, we'll see in a minute.
There was even a movie made when I was younger called Being There.
Right. I think it was actually.
What is that?
I believe it was a French comedian.
Horse.
Being There. And mostly the whole notion behind all of this comes down to a sad euphemism. No matter where you go, there you are. You're here right now. And that's the there thing, I think, in a nutshell, is there is a super timeliness of your awareness of who you are, where you are, and what you're about to do. Being there.
You are clearing.
Mm-hmm. You can either be not responsible for it, or you can be responsible for it.
That's actually, I think, yeah, it's moralizing Heidegger, but I think that's what it comes down to for me too. Like, you can be responsible for where you are, or you can not.
Well, and I don't know if it's in chapter 6 or if it's in the beginning of division 1, or I mean 2, but that's going to be another thing that he's appropriating from other belief systems is the call of conscience. And he's going to be playing off of the phenomenon where you definitely feel a pull to do something that you know you're more cut out for, or that you should be doing, versus like sometimes, or maybe you feel like, yeah, there's a sense of alienation or disassociation or even a sort of existential guilt or dread with going about a certain way of life, right? Like, okay, I took the career path my dad always told me I should, and now I hate my life. And it's like, well,
I'll kill myself if I end up in suburbia.
Right. Yeah. And it's like, well, that's what he's talking about. Like he's and he'll say it's like the foundation of responsibility. When the class I took for this book, like the professor said to just, because people were getting really hung up on guilt, and it kept coming up in the conversations. People just kept bringing it into their Christian framework, and he kept being like, stop it. Think of it as responsibility, right? Like, we're talking about the ontological grounds of your own personal sense of responsibility for your life. You only have a limited amount of time here. You have to choose between doing this and that. And, it is this is where all the existentialists get going. And I think it is in division 2.
Those.
Huh?
Those.
Oh.
Well, I actually think that's a good place to park. But
yeah, I feel like
anything else to say?
Satiated here. Does anybody else have any lingering
Not particularly
questions,
text-related.
comments, concerns? In 3 seconds, we'll turn to Brian's textually related question.
Oh, it's not even a question. It's just a pondering. And it's really totally more or less outside the scope of this conversation.
Is it that one?
No.
Oh.
We can't. Oh, is that what you want me to turn to?
Well, that's what I assumed you were talking about.
No, I was just thinking about a professor of mine. Anyway, yeah, so let's turn to this. So David and I have been discussing some potential changes to the reading schedule. And there are a few options we've thrown around, and whatever people kind of want to do. One of them would be, and this is why it's coming up now, one of them would be stopping between divisions 1 and 2 to read some essays, some Heidegger essays from the later works. Huh?
So wait, real fast. So, well, yeah. So just as a background, because like I don't think anyone saw this on the syllabus. This was on the syllabus at one point, and so someone might have seen it even. It had tracks 1 and 2 for the second half of this course. Track 1 was you finish out division 2. Track 2 was reading 4 essays from basic writings, including The Question Concerning Technology, On the Origin of Truth, the Origin of the Work of Art, no, On the Essence of Truth, The Origin of the Work of Art, and Building, Thinking, Dwelling. So those 4 essays are pretty foundational, and he's well known for those because this is where he takes everything he develops in Being and Time, and then he moves past it a little bit as he takes it to art, or takes it to technology, or takes it to architecture and how we live in the world. And so like it's something that we want to do for sure. The question is like we were going to talk about, so we have the question was like to read half of Being in Time and then do those essays, or do the full thing. And then this was before we'd even like really set the course going. We were like finishing the book, because we've been saying that, and began reading this, like we've been saying, our goal is to go harder and more in depth and cover to cover. And so taking a stand on full texts, right? But at the same time, if we're talking about a break for between divisions, it could be to do all 4 essays. It could be to do 1 essay. It could be to do the easiest essay, or it could be just a week off. It depends. I don't. Brian doesn't like that. I feel like we might lose some steam if we did. Yeah, it sounds tempting, but we also might lose some steam. I don't know. Like we're on a roll here.
I would just take a week of not reading and then rush it all at the end because I got too lazy and then it just all feel shitty.
So I guess the question is, did I do an adequate job painting like the kind of spectrum of where our heads are at now?
Right, which also means anyone who's waiting for Derrida, we kind of pushed off until after the rest of Division 2 and the essays have been read. The essays will take maybe 2 weeks most.
Where would that put Derrida?
I'd have to think. Put it ending probably at the end of November.
See, because that'd be a really.
We don't want to have anything going on in December.
We could make it happen after finals. You're saying at the end of November.
That would be the conclusion.
Oh.
Derrida. No, because like we talked about with everyone between Thanksgiving and throughout the holidays, it's not a good idea to have anything going on.
When will we get through? When would you project that we were going to get through?
I mean,
this?
We'd have to look at it.
Because all I'm thinking is that, I mean, like, when was Derrida projected to start?
Roughly end August, beginning of September, if I remember
So
correctly.
it was like mid-August is when
we would start.
We'll be done with Being in Time mid-August.
Okay.
And that was hypothetically when we do a grammatology. But at the same time, like well, okay, the question of when to do Derrida is because the thing is like the Heidegger essays could also follow Derrida, and so I think it's something more that we should be rather the bulk of those. If we were doing 1 essay for break, then that just pushes it off a week. So then the whole conversation of like how Derrida fits in and if we do Derrida before the essays or not, then that becomes something immaterial for this exact conversation. That if we were to do all of those essays, then I guess that becomes super relevant right now.
I think we should just keep on Being in Time.
Okay.
That's my vote, because the essays are like, okay, the essays are really important, but just because they're essays, one shouldn't. Word is failing me. Underestimate how much work should be put into like interpreting those essays. Especially, there's a few of them that are just really like hefty, actually. And I think that, like, yeah, we want to be understanding Heidegger, but like if the essays are mostly sort of like filling in gaps or they, like, he didn't make Division 3, so they are Division 3. I think it just makes sense to finish this first. I'm also prejudiced because I've read some of the essays, so I don't want to, like, reread them as much as someone who might want to read them for the first time.
I'm pretty neutral on where they fall. Honestly, actually, after this conversation, I'm more feeling like it's better just to move straight into division 2. Because we're in the same text. I mean, it's a division break, but it's still the same book.
And maybe, and I think temporality
problems
would help us understand some of those essays. So that's my vote. And
as far as language appropriation goes, also, I'll just say that I'm leaning in the direction you all are, because as far as like appropriating the language of Heideggerianese goes, we just got, as Jacob pointed out, like this grand summary of a lot of the jargon on one page. And it's like, and this was like the most pulled together chapter so far, because he's done a lot of unpacking of these other concepts so far. And so by the time we're done with care in chapter 6, like I would say like that's the time to move into the next thing, because the terminology will be more ready to hand at that point. I don't know. But I mean, taking a week off to read Building, Thinking, Dwelling, so question concerning technology, I wouldn't want to do that any shorter than 2 weeks, and maybe even 3 weeks, but probably 2 weeks. Origin of the Work of Art would have to be 3 weeks, just because that'd be like 35 pages per week. I already did the breakdown. But Building, Thinking, Dwelling, though, that's easily 1 week. And so I wouldn't think about any of the other options very seriously at this point.
I want to hear what the other participants have to say.
Yeah, Joel, Jacob, Ty.
I don't care anyway. I don't have any preferences.
Neither do I.
Okay. Heidegger would say that the fact that you don't care is predicated on the fact that you do care, though, by the way, just saying.
Well, I do care, but I'm taking the Lareulean move to refuse to distinguish myself.
It would be to distinguish yourself?
I'm refusing. I'm refusing to give an answer.
Will you give an answer to whether or not you actually want to read those essays in the first place? As in, if we do them afterwards, will you participate with us?
I've thought about reading The Question Concerning Technology in the past, and I would probably read that at either point with you guys if you read it. I don't know about the essays. Other essays, maybe. I haven't. I don't know anything about them.
Yeah, cool. It's like one of my favorites, and part of the reason it's one of my favorites is because it's finally made sense to me, and I read it like 8 times. But like on the essence of truth is supposedly like one of the most important things he's written. I mean Michael Downs said besides being in time that on the essence of truth is the most important. I've read it twice. It sort of makes sense. I don't know if I can really vouch for that or not. But anyway, as far as, and Lee Braver has a book that is a complement to the book Basic Writings. Must have. I mean, because he does like a walk you through each of the essays in Basic Writings. So I haven't read them all, but I've just read the ones for the essays I have read. So anyway, it feels like it almost doesn't need to be put to a vote or anything because it seems obvious at this point, right?
Yeah.
So
Continuing on.
Continuing on.
Chapter 6 in Division 2.
If you like to scope out bookstores and think and prepare for things, and if you don't like using handouts, and you would like to read The Question Concerning Technology in the future, then I definitely recommend Basic Writings over the other anthologies that would offer the same. There's at least 1 or 2 other ones, but like Basic Writings has more essays, and they're the more essential ones.
I'll lean into that.
Lean into it.
I like our new meaning for lean in because I'm so tired of the old one.
I'll get disburdened on caring about that. Yeah. All right, everybody. Any closing thoughts?
Ty's on his phone. Brad's on his phone.
No, I was looking at the movie Being There was made in 1979. Okay, shows my age. sellers.
Cool. Also, we should have a movie night soon for Hubert Dreyfus and his students and fellow scholars, the documentary they made called Being in the World.
It's a beautiful, beautiful documentary.
Yeah, it's good. It kind of unpacks the basic.
Just do it while I'm not here because I have watched it.
Okay, we'll do it in the next couple of weeks.
Okay. Bye,
Next
guys.
week.
And wait, Dave, before you leave this group chat, could you copy the things Jacob pasted because they're cool? And
Oh, we'll do that.
okay.
All right, guys. Everyone, thank you so much for joining.
Bye.
Take care.
Good night.
Bye. Bye.
All right.
Really looking forward to care.
I'm going outside.
The bass is about to drop.
Yeah.
Are you uncomfortable there?
Huh?
Are you uncomfortable there? Is it hot?
No.
It won't stop.
You know,
It's
broadcasting.
hot. That's all.
You
trying
know,
to save it.
there's air blowing out. If you wanted it to
Turn it
cold,
on.
or all you had to do was tell me.
No, it's fine. My house is hot too.